Hello, welcome. My name is Michelle, and we have Adam and Ryan joining us here for the webinar tonight. We are presenting the One Island, One Earth project. I am currently the Conservation and Climate Coordinator at the Galiano Conservancy, and with us joining here today, we also have Adam, who's the Restoration Coordinator, and we have Ryan Mackey joining us from BCIT, Center of Eco-Cities, and CHRM Consulting. So we're going to start off by diving on in. Adam, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Thank you, Michelle. As Michelle said, this project is called the One Island, One Earth project. Maybe in some ways a little bit of a misnomer, because we always intended, as you can see from the logo for the project, that that the information that we generated would apply to other islands as well. And so really the purpose of our session today is to explain the results of the project and how they can be applied to other small island communities across the coast of British Columbia and Washington as well, and perhaps even elsewhere. But locally for us, I think the information is most relevant to our Salish Sea region. So this project, why did we do it? We were thinking as a small island conservancy, what can we do in the face of the climate crisis? Obviously, in 2018, we saw the report from the IPCC on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. It was alarming, as it should have been, and it was immediately followed by the Islands Trust declaring a climate emergency. And here on these small island communities, we often don't have the same kind of information at our fingertips that the large urban centers around us do, or the same programs, levels of funding, those kinds of things. We are in it for ourselves. And so we saw that Salt Spring Island was working on a climate action plan for themselves. We thought to ourselves, how can we contribute to this conversation? What can we do as a small island to contribute? And the Galiano Conservancy Association, it's over 30 years old now. And even looking back a couple decades, the people that started this organization and that have kept it going were always thinking, how can the islands punch above its weight, and how can we use it to educate the broader population that comes to visit here, or school groups that we bring to our education programs here? Even going back 20 years, that was always the thought process, is how can we use the island itself as an educational tool? And so that brings us to ecological footprinting. Ecological footprinting is very interesting. It originates in British Columbia. It comes out of UBC. William Rees and Matthias Wackernagel, of course, published the first book on it in the 90s. It was actually published on Gabriola Island. So it is a local sort of homegrown tool for looking at our human footprint on the planet, and especially with the climate crisis, our contribution to that, and potentially avenues for us to mitigate the damage that we're causing on a daily basis to our climate. Interestingly, the ecological footprint tool has been used by the surrounding urban communities quite extensively. Vancouver has been doing it for over a decade now. They've done several iterations of ecological footprinting to set a baseline and then to see how well they've done over time in reducing their footprint. Saanich and Victoria have also produced ecological footprints, as has Powell River. And municipalities across the province are currently engaged with Ryan and Cora's help from BCIT and from CHRM Consulting in ecological footprinting. So, our thought was, can we apply this to an island, and what can we learn from the results that we receive and about our footprint as island communities, and also about islands themselves. Looking around now a little bit broader from just our region, we tried to see if anybody else had done this. And we did find one place, one small island community off the coast of Germany called Helgoland. About a decade ago, Dr. Beate Ratter and her student Jan Petzold took a bunch of students to Helgoland and documented the ecological footprint of this island. And really, as far as we can tell, it's the first time anybody tried this on a small island community. In a comparison to Galiano, the resident population is very similar between the two, but you can see that Galiano Island is much bigger, an order of magnitude bigger than Helgoland in terms of spatial area. And at the time, Dr. Ratter and her colleagues found that the ecological footprint of Helgoland, the average Helgoland resident would require 4.3 Earths, or Earth equivalents, if the entire global population lived that same lifestyle. And in fact, an area of land at least the size of 62 Helgolands. So not great, and certainly a higher result than Germany was producing at the time in general, and the urban centers, especially Berlin, much lower footprint than Helgoland. So a bit of a shock to the system for a small island, which we might consider to be sustainable. So this is what set us off and running, and this project has been spearheaded by Michelle. She worked with Ryan and with our other project partners at the Global Footprint Network and the BCIT EcoCity Center to really crunch these numbers, collect the data, put it all together. And I'll hand it over to her from here on out.
So looking at the One Island, One Earth project, we focused, there's three main components. We were looking to create an estimate of the biocapacity that Galiano Island is producing, the ecological footprint, which is like the consumption that as a whole of a community is being consumed. And then we also looked to document an ecological fingerprint, which is a little bit more of the qualitative views of the island at this point in time. So this presentation, we're going to mainly dive really deep into the biocapacity in the ecological footprint, and we'll just talk a little bit about the ecological footprint at the end of the presentation. So biocapacity, the definition of biocapacity is it represents the productive potential of an area's biological productive land and water. So it was very important for us to look at not only the land biocapacity, but also the water, because people have lived off of the biocapacity of the water in these areas for many, many years. So we thought that it was crucial to include water biocapacity as well. We'll get into how that sparked a lot of debates on how much water biocapacity to use. So the data that we compiled ourselves to provide the Global Footprint Network with was an updated land use map, updated aerial imagery, the marine net primary productivity. We had to decide on a marine buffer, how much water to include, and then also carbon sequestration values. So the land use map, we had an old land use map from 2004, and we took the time to update it using more updated aerial imagery maps, as well as ground truthing as needed. I think that's definitely kind of the biggest data point that's needed both for biocapacity and the ecological footprint, because that's kind of a key. Each of those categories is important for calculating these types of things. The aerial imagery, most islands should be able to get this from the government. There's a new 2021 aerial imagery out right now. And then net primary productivity, we did have a little bit of local data, but nothing really usable from the Global Footprint Network. So we reached out to See Around Us, and they provided the 2018 catch numbers of the entire Pacific West Coast of Canada. And then they took an average based on the surface area that we included with the marine buffer. So that's one of the reasons that we actually believe our marine biocapacity is a slight underestimate, because they're taking the kind of whole Pacific West coastline of Canada. We are in a warmer, well, the warmest part, if you look how far south we are, which will be a little bit more productive, as well as being closer to shores is being more productive as opposed to further. So our marine buffer, we decided to do a 2-kilometer buffer around Galiano Island, but we didn't want to take other islands' biocapacity. So what we did was we created polygons with a 2-kilometer buffer for all of the islands that share kind of a water border with Galiano, and then took the midpoint of that. And the reason being for that is we wanted to give other islands the opportunity to use the same methodology of us without us double counting. So you can see in the picture, that's kind of our marine buffer that we did around. So it's more of the full 2 kilometers on the side closer to Vancouver, and then on the interior, kind of at the midpoint with islands like Salt Spring and Prevost and things like that. Coming up to our carbon sequestration values, we were actually very, very fortunate to stumble upon a report that was previously done for the area for Coastal Douglas Fir Zone, and provided that to the Global Footprint Network. And we filed a request to get the data from the Islands Trust for mapping layers and everything like that to provide to the Global Footprint Network as well. So if you are located within the Islands Trust, you will have access to this type of data as well. You just have to do a little bit more paperwork to get it approved to be able to provide those numbers. But what we're here to talk about today is kind of, this is what we did, but we've kind of created a little bit of a shortcut way so that you're able to get a rough estimate of the biocapacity of your island. So before I talk about that, I will talk a little bit about our results for those that are curious. We came to the conclusion that we have an estimate of 14,839 global hectares of biocapacity on Galiano Island. And it was pretty split, 50-50 between marine and land contribution to that total. And we've also kind of concluding within that, that our ecosystems are 36% more productive than the average terrestrial ecosystem on Earth. So it kind of gave us that, that motivation that protecting land in this area, because we're able to hold more productivity on less area. So we've created a tool, an Excel spreadsheet that will be available on our website later. And this is why I've kind of hence the importance of the updated land use map. Because if you're able to identify through our land use definitions and come up with an area for each of these land use categories, this tool will help provide an estimate of the total biocapacity of your island. This is, of course, for islands that are within our zone and Coastal Douglas Fir ecosystem, but that's definitely an easier way to do. What we did was we actually took Main Island as an example to kind of just roughly look at their land use map, try to match it with our land use definitions to see how easy it is and what we can produce. And besides defining the land use categories, making sure they're mapping, we also had to create a marine buffer for them, which did take a little bit more time and did actually give them a little bit less of a marine buffer than, say, like Galiano, just due to the proximity of neighboring islands. But we did it, and we came up with the estimate of 6,178 global hectares for Main Island. Now, Main Island, for those who don't know, has about a similar population to Galiano, but is smaller in size and is more developed and has more fields as opposed to more forested areas. Yeah, so compared the total biocapacity of Main and Galiano, you can see on the chart on the right there that the total biocapacity per hectare, Main's at 2.6, Galiano's at 5.4, and we have the Canadian average, which is of course very high due to our low population and vast spaces, and then the world average there at 1.6.
And I'll butt in here for a second just to say that world average number is the most important. That's the number that's used for all of the global footprint network's calculations in terms of the amount of Earths that each community or city or country or that we as a planet uses relative to what is available, right? And so at a global scale, what we're looking at is a very, very low number for the amount of people that we have on the planet currently. Obviously it's going to be higher for us here in Canada because there is a lot of land and relatively few people, and much of the land is still quite productive. But here on the Gulf Islands, our even though our population density is not very high, the land areas that we're living on are quite small, and quite productive and quite biodiverse. So very much worth protecting and investing in restoration for. But that's the picture that we have here, and these biocapacity calculations are estimates, and you can see from our marine buffer that they're not going to be perfect estimates, and this changes over time based on what kinds of land use happen on islands and how well the ecosystems are conserved, how well those areas are performing. So the biocapacity piece is, I think, really interesting. It gives you a sense of proportionality with respect to the population and the footprint and the islands itself. But when we're looking at what we're actually targeting as island communities, we're looking at that world average biocapacity of how can we get our footprint in line with the world average, and not necessarily with the island or with the Canadian average. It's like we have to consume more per capita to reach that Canadian average, and we don't want to be doing that. So yeah, just to say that piece about biocapacity before we move on to the footprint.
Yeah. So moving on to the ecological footprint, we worked with Ryan with BCIT and CHRM Consulting, and their methodology has 5 components. So waste, energy, transportation, food, and water. Now, since Galiano is primary well-based, we didn't actually include the water component. But if your island does have kind of like an example like Salt Spring, where you do have municipal water, that's something that you'd have to note is being excluded or not accounted for within the footprint. So what we did was we looked at all of the information that BCIT needed from us, and we collected from all different sources, different levels of government, our local recycle center, Stats Canada, BC Hydro, ICBC, all that type of thing. And we identified data gaps, and we created surveys for the community based on those data gaps. So things like food, we had no idea what people's diets were like or where their food was coming from. We created a survey for that. We created a survey for what people are throwing away, what's their average waste, as well as transportation. So these were definitely, this data can definitely be applied to other islands, even for other projects. We're very open with sharing this type of data. Like we said, we did our best to try to find that, and it wasn't there. So this is, I think, a part that definitely can be recycled through other projects around. I know a few food organizations have reached out and asked for some of our numbers about local on island versus off island consumption and things like that. So our footprint, we included full-time residents, part-time residents, and tourists all within our ecological footprint results. Now, for applying the ecological footprint to your own island, I think one of the more important pieces of information is the ratio between full-time, part-time, and tourists on your own island. So some islands might have much higher part-times and less full-time, or very high tourists, but that's a piece of data that would be good to have to kind of scale the footprint accordingly to your own island. And then, of course, we have government services taking a very major chunk of our ecological footprint. What we found specifically for Galiano was that our footprint was pretty split 50-50 between full-time residents as kind of one category, and then part-time and tourists as another. It was split 50-50 between that, which was quite interesting. So as kind of our quick way that you can apply our project to your own island. These are some areas of possible differences. Like I mentioned, the ratio between full-time, part-time, and tourists. An important piece is if you do have this information, we use the assumptions that part-time tourists remain on island for about 101 days on island, and that tourists' average trip is about 4 days on island. So what we did was we would find the amount of part-time and the amount of tourists and then times it by that amount of days and then apply that to a year. So we would be getting seasonal visitors, like an average of seasonal visitors, almost like another whole person is living on the island for their amount of contribution to being on island. I don't know if that makes sense, if I was confusing at all. But yeah, we're pretty much we're calling the part-time and tours we put together, and we're calling them seasonal visitors. Another area that was interesting is the amount of built area. And I bring this up because Galiano had above average for how much built area we have compared to our size and our community size. So determining whether the built area is actually higher or lower than Galiano would be an interesting note to see whether our results for that section are applicable to your island, or if they might be a little off. Along with power usage, we had high power usage, which is probably because of like lack of insulation in houses and that type of thing, which might be a fairly common theme across the other islands. But kind of comparing to see if the power usage of your island is above or below the kind of provincial averages. And then water, like I mentioned, if you have a different water system, that's something that would not be counted within this. So using Maine as our consistent example, we took a look at Maine Island and looked at the amount of full-time residents, seasonal residents, or seasonal visitors, and applied that ratio. So you can see that Maine has about a similar population to Galiano, but that they get less seasonal visitors. So they have less tourists and part-time residents. And so we came up with the ratio that for one full-time resident, there's about 0.8 of a seasonal visitor from Maine Island. We also looked at the built area. So the built area is actually higher than Galiano Island, which kind of just relays that using our data and information and the scaling up is still useful, because we're all above average on that. So we were quite shocked of how much the developed area takes up in our footprint, because we're so above average. So on our website, we have kind of the raw report that BCIT and CHRM provided for us. And they provided a scenario for us that was only the full-time residents, as well as a scenario that was everything that I just described, all three put together. So if you're looking to do this for your own island at home, what we did was take the amount for just the full-time residents. And of course, we subtract that from the other footprint to get what the footprint would be just for the part-time and tourists, and created that ratio. And then applied the ratio from Maine Island to scale down the seasonal residents. After the ratio is complete, an additional part, because these parts do not include, this is before government services. So in order to apply government services, we multiplied 2.75 global hectares by the population of Maine. When I say population, I mean the community population. So it's including the part-time and tourists. When I said we applied those to a year to make them extra people on the island. So Maine's whole community population, it's what the amount of resources that are actually stressed for that amount of people from tourists and part-time is 2,367. So we multiplied that by the per person for global hectares and came up with the chunk of government services for main island. So then we put this all together. So we take the full-time residents, global hectares, and we take the seasonal, which was scaled down due to the less seasonal visitors. And then we add it to the government services. And we've come up with 16,500 global hectares, or 7 global hectares per capita. So this is with government services. Without government services, you can see in the bottom, it's a little less, but I think presenting and accounting for government services on a public forum is a good idea, just to get an idea of how much the government takes up. We were all quite shocked to see that how big the government services contribution was from our footprint. So with these 2 pieces of information, we can kind of see if Maine is living within the biocapacity that the island is producing, which was another question that we had for Galiano specifically. So we can see here that if we take the biocapacity and then we subtract the ecological footprint, we can see that we are in a biocapacity deficit. So for the amount of biocapacity that Main Island is producing, the consumption is overshooting by 168%, or I think it's 2.6 main islands. Which is something that we also did for Galiano, comparing the biocapacity to the footprint, and we got about 1.3 Galiano islands. For us as a tool, because you'll see actually on the next slide when we compare it to how many Earths, I think that the island tool is a little more, I think, I don't want to say necessarily reachable, but I think presenting the 1.3 to the community, I've had more better reciprocation when chatting with people than telling people how many Earths it takes. So for Galiano, we're at 4.3 Earths, which I found can be overwhelming when discussing with people, but talking about comparing the 1.3, a lot of people are like, oh, only like 30%. That's more manageable. We can get down to that. Of course, our goal is to get down to 1 Earth, but looking for those different places of motivation within the public, I think is also important. So you can see other places have done it as well. So Maine is slightly more Earths, and that's mainly because they have less people to spread it across. And you can see places like Victoria and Vancouver are also at 3.5. And then our average Earth resident, we are still over, we are not at 1 Earth. And this is all to take into consideration that within all of this, we're not leaving any resources for nature, for the wild, for other plants and animals. This is just for humans' resources. All right, now we get to the ecological fingerprint section, which is a little more unique, a little bit more of a newer concept, also done in Helgoland, Germany, which is where the idea came from. So we conducted 23 interviews. We also conducted some school visits with the Galiano Community School, and we also had artwork done by local artists. And we were looking to get what common themes people discussed about environmental change over their lifetime on Galiano Island. So we've got a lot of interesting themes came up. We had barriers for access to traditional harvesting, increase in traffic, limited groundwater. A lot of problems came up through different groups of people. And then what we did was we did our best to kind of match those with some of the reductions that would be needed to get us down to, say, a 1 Earth scenario. So if you can see, for something like reducing food waste on the island was a recommendation to get us down to 1 Earth. After talking with people, we saw that there is a desire to grow and harvest more locally. So we produced these kind of potential community actions, which would be increase access to harvest areas and localized production. So this was kind of our way to do our best to kind of weave the quantitative and qualitative parts together and to come up with some community actions. Yeah, we have many different ways that we've presented the results of our project in particular for Galiano Island, this being one of them. But we have lots more information on our webpage. We also have an interactive web map with different layers for kind of each component and also presenting more of the information. There's even a few interviews on the website too from our fingerprint section. And we actually have a podcast coming up soon from Future Ecologies. Yeah, if anyone has any other questions or information, feel free to email oneisland@galianoconservancy.ca. And I think I'm going to open it up if anybody has any questions. We also have Ryan here for if anybody has more in-depth methodology questions about how BCIT goes about their entire process.
Thank you, Michelle. And one thing I wanted to say here at the end is that we did this for Galiano Island in a detailed manner, so that we could take this information and bring it to our community, but also so that we could form fit it and help other islands use this information so that they don't have to do all of the intensive data gathering and calculation that we did. So if you are interested in coming up with a ecological footprint calculation for your island, you can get in touch with us. We will help you. We'll provide information. And really, it's going to be generally very similar to what we've just presented here in terms of the footprint for Galiano or for Maine. There might be some different factors on each island that pushes the margins on a particular piece of it, whether it's food or transportation. But the general outline of the footprint is going to be very similar across the islands. So, you can get in touch with us and we'll help you form fit it to your island a little bit better, or you can just run with the results that we have. The 4.3 Earth figure is pretty solid for the island communities that we live on, give or take a couple points there. So Michelle, there was a question about what is included in the provincial and federal government services.
Yeah, provincial government services are accounting for things like healthcare, military, administrative services, things like that. So that takes quite a big chunk. It's kind of, Ryan can probably answer it better than me, but it goes across the whole population. But Ryan, I don't know if you want to add some more there.
No, I think that covers it. Yeah, infrastructure as well, like highways and things like that. You think anything that you think of anything that the province or the federal government's responsible for, and that would fall into that category.
So did you include ferries?
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'd be interested in how you did that.
The ferries are part of the community footprint, by the way, at least the ferry trips. So they aren't included in that federal and provincial services. Ryan could speak to maybe whether there's part of that ferry infrastructure that's captured there. But the ferry is right in our island transportation budget.
Okay.
Yeah, it is handled separately from that government services. You're right. Yeah.
So you were able to get trips just from BC Ferries?
Yeah. So I guess just at a really high level, I guess the methodology is we looked at the total emissions for the relevant routes. And then looked at travel patterns to allocate those emissions to the different groups, either to the Galiano and the other islands, and then also split it between the tourists and the part-time residents and the full-time residents based on survey data and other studies that are looking at the travel patterns and how much of those trips are being used by the different groups.
Mm-hmm. So does the data, the results data show like how much that added? The ferry would be, I imagine, pretty substantial.
Definitely, yeah. It was definitely a much larger piece of the travel footprint than we would see in other communities, non-island communities. But then other factors of the transportation were much lower. Like, for example, the private vehicles, the impacts from private vehicles were only about a third of what we would see in other communities. So yes, ferries are much larger, but private vehicles are much smaller, and it's just because people are using the ferry to move around much more and not their vehicles. So overall, it actually came out fairly similar, but yeah, the split between ferries and private vehicles and other modes of transportation, the ferries were obviously a much larger piece.
Yeah, and just following up on that, in terms of like transportation is the largest single category for the footprint for Galiano by a pretty long shot. And we found that in general, there's a pretty reasonable split between the ferries, on island and off island transportation by personal vehicle, and then also a fairly high footprint of air travel for the island community as well. Higher than provincial average, I believe, significantly so.
And that came
so
through our
those
surveys.
components are all in there. Yeah. So yeah, and specifically, this session is sort of designed to help other islands figure out how to kind of form fit our work to their island. But in terms of like the specific breakdown of all the different footprint categories and how the islands are doing on each of them, that's available just in the executive summary of the report on our website and all that kind of stuff. I know we didn't go deeply into each of the categories for food and transportation and stuff like that today. Yeah. But that information is there, and like I said, it should be reasonably representative, within a reasonable margin of error for other islands.
Yeah, well, it's so excellent. It's really interesting how you did this, and I'm sure other islands would certainly be interested in either replicating or seeing. To me, the actionable items are the most important part. Like, what do you come out of it with? And so I'm interested in what your next step is.
Yeah, that's the question for us too. And we've got a survey out right now for the community to try to figure out where they want, because we're just one organization of several on the island and not a level of government. So we're here to kind of contribute in the ways that are best suited to us. And obviously we're going to keep doing the things that we're really good at, protecting land and restoring areas and educating kids and that kind of thing. But trying to push into some of these other areas as well, right? To take up that climate action space that, on Salt Spring Island, Transition Salt Spring has really moved into that space and is doing great work there. For the smaller islands, we might not be able to have a dedicated organization for each of those things. We might have to, spread into those areas and get that work done. But, that's kind of the next piece of the work.